Boa noite a todos. Eu gostaria de dar boas-vindas. Se é a primeira vez que vocês vêm a esses eventos, essas são as nossas Varandas ITS. Acho que o nome é autoexplicativo, né? Porque a gente costuma fazer os eventos aqui fora, na varanda, e aproveitando essa noite carioca e à vista aqui do Rio de Janeiro. Esses eventos costumam ser mensais, são eventos sempre gratuitos. Sempre a gente faz um esforço para trazer cervejas artesanais de produção local aqui do Rio de Janeiro, para fazer uma espécie de degustação, apoiar também esse movimento. Para quem não conhece, o Instituto de Tecnologia e Sociedade é um instituto que faz pesquisas na interconexão da tecnologia com diversos campos sociais. Então a gente estuda o impacto da tecnologia para a economia, para a política, para a cultura, para a ciência. E a gente tem vários projetos em diversas áreas. Quem depois tiver interesse, convido para conhecer o nosso site e os nossos projetos. E nessa série de eventos, a gente já recebeu palestras e algumas falas muito interessantes. Já tivemos aqui conosco Ethan Zuckerman, do MIT Media Lab. Já tivemos aqui Ivan Krastev, do Instituto de Democracia de Viena. Já tivemos o Eric Rosenbaum, também do MIT. Então a gente tem sempre organizado esses eventos com o objetivo de compartilhar com a comunidade aqui do Rio de Janeiro visitantes e pessoas com quem a gente trabalha, ou com quem a gente coopera, para que elas tenham acesso público, para que não fique só internamente ao nosso instituto, mas que haja a possibilidade de interagir e conversar e debater com, vamos dizer, a comunidade de forma geral aqui no Rio de Janeiro. Então, quem tiver interesse em acompanhar esses eventos, pode acompanhar a nossa página no Facebook do ITS, pode acompanhar também o nosso site, e a gente sempre tem alguma novidade ou alguma fala como essa que a gente vai ter aqui à noite. Dito isso e apresentado o nosso instituto, é uma satisfação muito grande receber hoje Marcus Boon. Marcus é professor da Universidade de York, do Canadá, baseado em Toronto. Ele é um autor, crítico cultural, jornalista, já foi DJ, faz pesquisas e fez pesquisas no mundo inteiro sobre cenas culturais subterrâneas, subculturas, culturas underground. Então é uma pessoa que tem um olhar muito interessante sobre a música, sobre a cultura, sobre as subculturas, e ele vai compartilhar conosco um pouco aqui hoje. Ele tem 2 livros, pelo menos, publicados, um sobre direitos autorais, chamado In Praise of Copyright. É um livro que trabalhei muito com a questão da pirataria, dirijo o projeto Creative Commons aqui no Brasil. É um livro que é muito inspirador, porque fala da apropriação e reapropriação da cultura como um elemento central da criatividade. Acredito que ele vai falar um pouco sobre isso hoje. E um livro muito interessante sobre budismo, chamado Nothing, onde ele também investiga práticas de religiosidade contemporâneas, onde ele trata do papel do budismo no contexto da cultura contemporânea. Acredito que ele também vai falar alguma coisa sobre isso hoje. Como já deu para ver, o evento é totalmente informal. A nossa ideia aqui é justamente fugir do formato formal da academia, né, propriamente dito. Quem quiser tomar cerveja, se levantar, pegar alguma coisa para comer durante a fala, fique à vontade. O Marcos vai falar por volta de 40, 50 minutos, e a partir daí a gente vai abrir para perguntas e interações para a gente conversar, e depois um tempinho no final para a gente descontrair também de forma livre. Quem quiser falar com ele pessoalmente ou interagir pessoalmente, pode ficar à vontade. Marcus, I was saying a lot of good things about you, so don't worry. I hope I was faithful to your bio, and it's really great to have you here. It's a privilege to have you here. I'm sure people are very interested to listen to you. And with that said, I'll hand you the floor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, hi. And yeah, thanks to Ronaldo and Victor and ITS for inviting me here. And thanks to my friend Hermana Viana for spreading the word that I was in Rio. And yeah, I'm happy to speak to you about my work on subcultures. And I have a very soft voice, so if you can't hear me, tell someone to turn the sound up a little, okay? And I wish I could deliver this lecture to you in Portuguese, but I can't yet. But yeah, I would love to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna start by playing a track. So has anybody heard that track before? Never. How about which country it's from? Any ideas, thoughts? UK? Close. It's true in a way. Yes. So, and in fact, it's an Adele track that a young guy in Durban, South Africa, called Citizen Boy remixed and threw up on a website devoted to a new kind of house music sound coming out of the city of Durban in South Africa. The music is called, I'm not very good at doing this, apparently it's the sound that a stone makes when you drop it on the floor, but I think the reference is to the bass drum sound, and just as there's a type of house music now called doof, I think also refers to this kind of particular bass kick. So I guess I begin with that piece of music. I think she said, fuck you for something or other. Because I'm interested in hauntings. I think this is what you see with subcultural sounds today, is that they pass around the planet very, very fast. And even though a very, very local scene, like this scene in Durban, South Africa, is still able to be generated, it's really a group of teenagers with relatively minimal hardware and software producing this music. And I would then say appropriating a track like Adele's Hometown Glory and transforming it and being able to put it up on the web again. It's and here I am able to play it to you in Rio de Janeiro. I think what interests me in subcultural scenes today is this idea of transits, translations, and the question of what it is that makes for a powerful or meaningful transit or a translation. And in this case, arguably, the South African house version of this song is probably more powerful than the original. It's like a radical reworking of it. And yet it sort of stays true to both something about the original and something of the local scene that it's a part of. And therefore, we're already in the territory of the copy and the passage of copies around the planet. So I'm going to read to you about appropriation. So this is a quote from Martin Heidegger from On the Way to Language. What if appropriation, no one knows when or how, were to become an insight whose illuminating lightning flash enters into what is and what is taken to be? What if appropriation, by its entry, were to remove everything that is in present being from its subjection to a commandeering order and bring it back into its own? Okay. On July 13th, 1977, the power grid went out in New York City, leading to widespread looting in poorer neighborhoods such as Harlem and the Bronx. It is this day which is credited in Yes Yes Y'all, a recent oral history of hip-hop, as being the moment of hip-hop's tipping point, where the technologies required for emceeing and DJing, turntables, mics and speakers, formerly available only to a small number of crews, were suddenly distributed to just about anyone who wanted them. We have a word for such activities, stealing. But at the same time, this stealing was crucial to hip-hop's full emergence as a globally active culture, teaching people around the world new ways of making music, appropriating old records and using them to construct new sounds, new ways of sharing it, from Africa Bambaata's Death Mix cassette, sold to New York City taxi drivers in the late 70s, to DJ Screw's mixtape sold out of his store in Houston, Texas, to the MP3 Bluetooth markets of the Sahel today, and also to new ways of living, the 5 elements of hip-hop, from breakdancing to graffiti, most of which were or are illegal in some sense or other. At this stage of the game, many of these innovations have been thoroughly commodified, but it's a mistake not to recognize the full power of what the Bronx Crew's come up with and what it still means for us today. The crises around property that are marked by the blackout riots in 1977 New York force us to think again about property, about what belongs to who, things that were supposed to have been definitively dealt with following the collapse of existing communist societies and George Bush Sr.'s declaration of a new world order. Today, contemporary understanding of appropriation oscillates between a countercultural celebration of the aesthetics and politics of appropriation as the subversion of hegemonic ideas of property on the one hand, and the critique of hegemonic histories of cultural appropriation on the other. Appropriation is a resonant word in terms of the history and constitution of Afro-diasporic communities themselves, through the vast and complex histories of various slave trades and wars, Arab, European, Euro-American, intra-African, through the figure of the Middle Passage as a movement of radical uprooting, through the struggles for equality, the right to assimilate or to refuse, throughout the Afro-diaspora. Reappropriation or counter-appropriation has been a trope of the widest significance for African diasporic communities. In the key P-Funk tune Chocolate City, George Clinton observes that we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule, but we did get UCC. It figures as a key aesthetic practice in the appropriation or reappropriation of a variety of technologies, from the turntable and the sampler to the spray can, along with a vast archive of visual, sonic, and other materials for the production of cultural artifacts resonant with the needs and desires of Afro-diasporic communities. This is the case in hip-hop, but it is equally so in reggae, and the emergence of dubs, stoned, spiritualized temporalities out of standard sound recording technologies given a twist by King Tubby and Lee Perry in Kingston, Jamaica in the late 1960s and early 1970s, or the appropriation of the debris of the oil industry by the Trinidadian steel drum bands, or the fabulous lo-fi sonic distortions of Kinshasa's Konono No. 1. We can also locate discourses of appropriation in colonial and pre-colonial African societies. For example, in rituals of possession where participants are taken over by deities, such as those shown in Jean Rouche's documentary film Les Maîtres Fous. Does appropriation play such an important role in Afrofuturist practices and discourses because of the traumatic, appropriative violence of European and American colonization? In other words, is the Afrofuturist aesthetic of appropriation always a provisional or strategic response to the relentless appropriations of the dominant culture, or does it point to some other, more sovereign vision of the universe, embedded in particular histories of African cultural practice that might be located in some trace or revelation of tradition, but whose significance, not to say power or fascination, at the global level, might precisely be located as part of an otherwise unimaginable or unattainable future? For these reasons, the Afrofuturist practice and theory of appropriation might illuminate the enigmatic status of appropriation within the Western philosophical tradition, as well as its obscured but omnipresent status as a vector of globalization. In particular, a certain politics of appropriation that is constitutive not only of the concept of the modern state, but broader categories of sovereignty, ownership, and belonging. In Locke's second treatise on government, which provided the philosophical basis for the first formulations of copyright law in the UK in the 18th century, property is appropriated from nature through labour. Ownership begins with our bodies and their capacity for labour and work. Through the sensuousness of labour, man establishes ownership of the commons of nature and God. Quote, "His labour hath taken it out of the hands of nature where it was common, and belonged equally to all her children, and hath thereby appropriated it to himself." Locke's discussion of appropriation is preceded, not insignificantly, by a discussion of slavery, which he is in favour of. There is a rich body of work on appropriation and property in the 19th century. This is hardly surprising, since at that moment the European powers were engaged in appropriation on an unprecedented global scale, turning the whole earth into a web of private property. Appropriation occurs repeatedly as a theme in Marx's work, including most famously in the Communist Manifesto, where the appropriations of the feudal system and the bourgeoisie are to be ended in favour of an appropriation of private property by the proletariat through a worldwide communist revolution. We could follow a philosophical trajectory through Nietzsche, who argues in Beyond Good and Evil that appropriation, as manifestation of the will to power, is the condition of life for itself, life itself. And we could follow this all the way through to Hart and Negri, who end their book Empire with an exhortation to a reappropriation of the earth by the multitude. Given that strategies of counter-appropriation pioneered by Afro-diasporic communities in the struggle against earlier iterations of empire and globally disseminated today through electronic media might provide the commonality of practice that enables the constitution of the multitude, the thought of appropriation is profound indeed. Here, at the outset, I would like to raise a doubt or question concerning appropriation that has its own history within the Western philosophical tradition, particularly in the deconstructive lineage that opens with Heidegger, Georges Bataille, and others in the middle of the 20th century, passing through Derridean deconstruction and French feminist thought. Georges Bataille puts it rather succinctly in an open letter addressed to his comrades in the Popular Front in Paris in the 1930s, published as The Use Value of the Marquis de Sade. In the letter, Bataille contrasts excretion with appropriation, and cautions his comrades that a revolution that thinks only in terms of the transfer of property rights has not even ventured towards the true revolutionary challenge, that of what to do with that which cannot be appropriated or held onto, that excess within every system that cannot be accumulated and held as property, but must be lost. In light of the collapse of existing communist societies, perhaps due to an inadequate understanding of appropriation, we are now forced to think beyond classically defined appropriation. Is it entirely a coincidence that Afrofuturist thought's emergence as a globally disseminated discourse through the complex ecologies of hip-hop occurs at the moment of this collapse? Of course, one version of hip-hop consists of an exemplary assimilation to the laws of the New World Order, imposed global capitalist marketplace, an assimilation that can be read in terms of particular skills in appropriation as strategy for survival. But there are other passages. For example, the emergence of free jazz, which was constituted by the creative reconfiguration of existing popular musical materials, such as popular song, motifs from classical and folk musics, etc. Although the trajectory into freedom music is marked through extraordinary appropriative efforts such as John Coltrane's version of the Rodgers and Hammerstein song My Favorite Things, 1960, or Albert Ayler's delirious version of Summertime, 1963, for the most part, free jazz is constituted by the refusal of such an external hegemonic referent. The ethics of improvisation involves a refusal to enter into the economimetic measurement and exchange of appropriation in favor of an ethos of experiment and improvisation. Paradoxically, improvising opens up an a-modern space which allows the possibility of the circulation of elements of folk tradition, including those of pre-colonial African societies, or some other idealized but symbolically potent traditional society, such as Alice Coltrane's India. Ornette Coleman's theory of harmolodics as a structure of freedom embedded in reciprocity also negotiates appropriation in this way, establishing an ethos of spontaneous mutual appropriation, or in Fred Moten's words, a new thinking and praxis of ensemble, an ontology of being together, established both at the level of phenomenology and the ensemble of the senses, where sound and vibration are revalued in their relation to other senses and to social and political ensembles composed of humans and non-humans. What exactly do we mean when we say appropriation? The word has at least two contradictory but related meanings. First of all, the sense in which it was used above, that of taking something and making or claiming it as one's own, or using it as if it was one's own. Secondly, that which is proper to a situation or a person, that which is appropriate. Appropriation, according to the first definition, often involves taking something which arguably belongs to someone else. There is a sense of seizing, of making a claim on something that is claimed by someone else. According to the second definition, it is that which one has a right to claim as one's own, which is properly one's own. We will set aside for now the question of where this right and claim came from. I began with a quote from Heidegger from a lecture given in January 1959. In it, the word appropriation is a translation of the German word Ereignis. The word is conventionally translated as event, but in consultation with Heidegger, Joan Stambour used the word appropriation, even though Aneignung is the more common word. Others have translated Ereignis as event of appropriation, being on the way, or owning. Still others say it's untranslatable. Heidegger uses the concept of Ereignis in working through his critique of the Platonic doctrine of identity as essence. Appropriation, in the sense of seizing something that belongs to others and making it one's own, belongs to the tradition of metaphysics, since it posits that things have essences that can belong to them, and at the same time that these essences can be stolen from them. The paradox is that if these things can be stolen, they can't really be essences which would not be transferable. An essence would stay in the place where it was supposed to stay. For Heidegger, the process by which these things came to appear to have essences relied on appropriation. In other words, that essence which appeared to belong to them was appropriated to them. Thus, it is appropriation rather than essence that is determinative of these things, although there is an ambiguity in the quote which I began with, since it is unclear when things are removed from their subjection to the commandeering order of metaphysics, science, industry, they will be restored to their own order or to the order of appropriation itself. What could own mean if not an essence? And where does properness come from if not essence? Okay, I'm going to play another track. This one you may know. How many people have listened to Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly? Good, about half of you. So I want to play a little snippet from the very end of the record where basically Kendrick Lamar takes an old interview with Tupac from the mid-90s, and he uses it to construct a new interview between Kendrick Lamar, and Tupac. And of course Tupac is dead, so it's a kind of conversation with a ghost. And it strikes me, if you don't believe what I just said about appropriation and the black radical tradition, it's such a beautiful example of appropriation that Kendrick Lamar ends this very powerful record by taking this recording of this dead rapper and then turning it into, or appropriating it into a new track. So I'm just going to play something from the very end of the track.
Of the legacy you left behind, I can truly tell you that it's nothing but
So, I mean, I said I was going to talk about vibration and energy, and I just want to kind of underline what's going on in that track there. That Tupac is saying an apocalyptic race war is about to kind of reignite in the US. And why limit it to the US? Why not just say it's a global crisis? And Kendrick Lamar's response to this, and it must be a considered response, is to say the only thing that you can really believe in today is music and vibrations. And that is what is left that one can put one's trust in this situation. And then he starts to speak about energy too, that when he raps, an energy possesses him that he does not know where it even comes from. And then Tupac's response, and of course it's really Kendrick's appropriation of the old interview to insert the sentence there, is to say the energy comes from the ghosts. The energy comes from the ghosts of history who speak through us at the moment that we speak. And, you know, in terms of an ontology of appropriation, the notion that we really do exist in a hauntology, that when we think we exist, when we think we speak, it is the ghosts of history that speak through us, that also is a version of appropriation. So I ended the last section by asking this question: if there was no appropriation any longer, if we refused to appropriate, if we depropriated, a word that I like a lot, depropriation, to refuse to make something an object of property, to set up a situation in which property is not the determinative structure of what goes on in the situation, that would be depropriation. If a situation of depropriation actually existed, if we inhabited it without reference to property, what would that situation involve? How would we orient ourselves? What would we find there? So one response begins like this. If we subtract property from being, what we are left with is vibration. Indeed, to live is to vibrate. Everything vibrates. The air, trees, the ocean, organisms, including human beings. Even the void between the planets may be said to vibrate, if recent propositions concerning a quantum ether are correct. Even decaying matter, dead things, have a half-life. So then we already need to modify our proposition. Decisions about what is alive and what is dead concern different types of vibration and different speeds or frequencies of vibration. Furthermore, to live more intensely is to increase the density of vibration or the speed of vibration. Thus, the world of affect, of feelings, may be a matter of vibration. Jouissance, orgasmic pleasure, joy are peak experiences of vibration. Conversely, states of meditation may also involve the calming of certain kinds of vibration. The Yoga Sutras begins with the statement, yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of consciousness and attunement, awareness of other kinds of vibration, of the body, of the environment, etc. The vibrating body is often an obscene body, a dangerous body, a body to be tabooed or abjected. We might speak of a generalized taboo on vibration, but what a strange idea that is. Speaking psychoanalytically and using the work of Julia Kristeva and Jacques Lacan, one might say that normal consciousness develops from a rejection of what Kristeva calls the chora, the disorganized pulsational matrix of drives in the infant body that is abjected in favor of the symbolic order, the Oedipal complex, language. But that vibratory matrix continues, and we stand in continuous ambivalent relationship to it, or to what Lacan calls jouissance. Indeed, we seek out experiences of vibratory intensity, and to the extent that this occurs outside of the law, one might say that vibration is queer. To say this is already to make a claim for sound. While sound, strictly speaking, is clearly but one kind of vibration, it also presents itself as a model or structure for thinking about, playing with vibration more generally. Of course, the visual arts themselves already present a long and rich history of reflection on vibration, whether we're talking about tantric Indian paintings, the waves and fields of Van Gogh's cornfields, Bridget Riley's optical fields of repetition, or Sachiko Kodama's Morpho Tower vibrating sculptures. I am interested in thinking of sound as a kind of vibration, music as a particular kind of organization of sound, popular music as all of the above, and therefore part of a set of practices that work with vibration. So that's a kind of basic point. All music is a kind of culture of vibration. The politics of vibration begins for me with a problem, the relative inaccessibility of vibration, that even as we speak of a vibrational ontology, in other words, of vibration as a or the fundamental constituent of reality, which is what contemporary physics, the most prestigious knowledge form that exists today, does, somehow vibration disappears in our very attempt to point to it, or it is bracketed as New Age, wishful thinking, or fantasy of omnipotence, of control of intangible, unverifiable forces, often of a religious nature. What does it mean to speak of vibration, to describe it? What is the relationship of language to vibration? If ontology can only speak of vibration, then what do we make of other kinds of practices, such as music making, that are capable of other, perhaps more direct modes of access to vibration? I am fascinated by song as a way in which language is sutured to vibration. That is what a song is, a vibrational structure with words attached to it, or vice versa. Song, in this sense, is both a specific instance of the appropriation of vibration and also a model for thinking about the politics of vibration more generally. Does such a model point to a set of practices that go beyond discourse in politically resonant ways? Or is vibration, because of its inaccessibility, never more than a form of what Slavoj Žižek calls autistic jouissance, always awaiting a necessary discursive ordering? I continue to be provoked by Jacques Attali's Girardian assertion of an essential relationship between music and violence. Music as the organization of sound performed as a sacrifice, in other words, ritualized violence, to ward off the threat of an otherwise uncontrollable violence that an unorganized sound would apparently constitute. I'm interested in rethinking this formula through Kristeva's work on objection and the Cora, and thinking about music in relation to a twofold taboo outlined by Freud, that on violence and that on eroticism. And all music, variably, has a negotiation of these taboos. That which is being tabooed, being for bataille, also imminent. In other words, you can't taboo something unless it's there to be tabooed. There's no point having a taboo on flying pink elephants, because you'll never be in a situation where you have to exercise that taboo. Only something that is there and actually needs to be pushed away has to be a subject of a taboo. Sex and death, love and violence mark the taboo, the block. Their articulation in music both articulates the block and potentially provides access to that which is beyond the block, as my mentor in this work, Catherine Christa Hennig, suggests. Presumably, all music, if I'm right, must take a stance regarding vibration. That broadly is what music is. Presumably, most music consists of suturing the taboo to vibration in itself, which is exactly what Attali means by sacrifice. That is also what I mean by the politics of vibration. Certainly, a discourse of vibrations runs through 20th century music, particularly the music of the 60s and 70s, from Lamont Young to psychedelic rock to reggae to free jazz, each with its own explicit politics of vibration. And I would say that's exactly what you hear in the Kendrick Lamar song. The question is, how do you mobilize vibration if it is the way to resolve this apocalyptic global war? I came to the phrase vibrational ontology through the work of Steve Goodman in his work Sonic Warfare, Sound, Affect, and the Ecology of Fear. Has anybody read Goodman? Okay, couple. Goodman has assembled a formidable set of connections in pursuing vibration, yet the displacement of vibration within the book actually blocks any positive articulation of a vibrational ontology. Goodman's discussion of vibrational ontology emerges out of an exploration of the political ecology of fear and the use of technologies and practices of vibrational force, both in warfare today and the broader biopolitical management of populations in modern societies. As a counterpoint to this instrumental use of vibration as force, Goodman writes of the way that subaltern dance or bass cultures appropriate such technologies to mobilize a community, transforming fear into joy. Amongst other things, this explains the preference some bass cultures have for the use of police siren sounds in the middle of dancehall sessions, the focus on intensely amplified sound that is situated at the threshold of pain and pleasure, audible and inaudible, clear and distorted, etc. The pervasive appropriation of military discourses in the language of sound clashes, DJ battles, etc. For early 21st century dwellers such as myself, who found the cultural studies discourse of popular and subculture highly inadequate in articulating what is so powerful about participating in musical cultures, Goodman's bold attempt to link musical cultures to fundamental ontological questions has opened up a number of new fields of inquiry. Having said that, there is something disappointing about Goodman's formulation as it stands, since it reduces collective experiences of vibration to mere epiphenomena of instrumental industrialized societies. Amongst other things, it would appear to imply that the collective celebrations of carnival or ecstasis are never ends in themselves, worked towards in an intentional way by groups of people, but that such events or practices only appear where a particular instrumental formation of power has already established itself in a primary or originary kind of way. Given that one can point to the presence of collective practices of sonically mediated joy as far back as history goes, why does Goodman relegate these practices to a secondary or compensatory function? While it is common these days to see carnival interpreted as a particular kind of cathartic jouissance that actually serves to maintain a particular dominant psychopolitical structure, such claims fail to explain the teleological persistence of joy, or to use Bloch's word, hope, in human and non-human societies, other than as a form of false consciousness. This would be a problem with the Foucauldian narrative, which vacillates between a public skepticism as to the possibility of autonomous, collectively assumed goals on the one hand, and a private pursuit of those same goals, occasionally and belatedly theorized by notions such as heterotopia, friendship, care of the self, etc., on the other. Conversely, those who argue that ecstatic jouissance is the primary ontological condition that human societies are built on, whether to repress, appropriate, or to be directly engaged with, fail to explain the persistent dystopian outcomes of communities built around an idea of unmediated jouissance. What is it about vibration, sonic or otherwise, that commits so many people to building such charged structures around it? To use everyday language, why does music seem to be such a matter of life and death, such a valuable thing to so many people today on the one hand, and yet such an ephemeral, subcultural thing on the other? The answer to these questions for me has to do with the implications of a fully developed vibrational ontology, which despite his deep commitment to bass culture, Goodman resists. What if the ontologies of vibrational force that Goodman focused on, with their obvious masculinist bias, focus on control, instrumentalization, etc., were actually secondary or at least reactive attempts to block the full opening up of a different, more fundamental vibrational ontology? Moreover, what if, in bass cultures generally, there was a kind of continuous conflict not only between instrumental hegemonic forces and subaltern semi-autonomous collectives, but between particular kinds of sonic appropriation and depropriation, at play at the micropolitical level in every gathering, every party, every production, dance, audition? And what would it mean to recognize a vibrational ontology as such? Are there particular political ecologies that allow a vibrational ontology to sustain or support a community in more or less meaningful ways? Conversely, is the notion of a fully immanent and articulated vibrational ontology itself a naive one, since the mediation of vibration is both necessary and inevitable? In his 1929 book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud set out a broad and powerful model for thinking about culture as a struggle between two fundamental human and arguably non-human, and also arguably cosmic forces, those of Eros and Thanatos, life and death, love and violence. Freud's model has a clear application to recent work on sonic subcultures. In Sonic Warfare, Goodman argues that contemporary sound cultures such as hip-hop and dancehall are built out of a reappropriation of military and industrial technological colonizations of the sound spectrum, putting them at the service of the people, who satisfy their own aggressive drives via this appropriation and sublimation of a pervasive violence. While Goodman's argument is very compelling in describing a long lineage of subcultural musics from Throbbing Gristle and the Stooges through Public Enemy and gangster rap, dancehall, reggae and grime, dubstep and so on, the absence of any discussion of eros or sexuality in his book is quite striking. But there are other texts, such as Timothy Lawrence's Love Saves the Day, which tell subcultural histories from the point of view of love and eros. And the lineage passing through disco, house music, rave culture, UK garage, etc., is obviously one with a distinct politics of eros. Here I explore the dynamic between eros and thanatos in recent music, such as the queer hip-hop of Leaf, the pornographic violence of Odd Future. One could multiply examples from black metal through Pharmacon's Industrial Noise, in which this dynamic manifests in increasingly explicit terms. Herbert Marcuse coined the term repressive desublimation to describe the explicit channeling of drives that one finds in contemporary capitalism. In Slavoj Žižek's terms, the current ideology of capitalism orders us to enjoy and to seek increasingly direct satisfaction of drive, erotic or thanatotopic, through the mechanisms of the marketplace. Nonetheless, contemporary sonic subcultures hold fast to the possibility of a non-repressive desublimation. In terms of my work, a thinking and experiencing of vibration itself that involves a truth. What do we mean when we speak of political music today? For example, taking the case of Egyptian music after the Arab Spring, one can come up with at least three possibilities. Firstly, music which participates in an explicit political discourse, such as the groups El Tambura and Escandarella, composed of various groups of folk and rock musicians who played in Tahrir Square throughout the January Revolution, often singing protest songs associated with the 1919 Egyptian Revolution, and composers such as Sayyid Darwish. Here, the lyrics serve as explicit political messages. Socially, the musicians participate directly in mass mobilization, often in very difficult conditions where there is tear gas, riot police, etc., and the music serves to generally evoke a concept of the people and their history outside of the prevailing conditions of domination. And I interviewed musicians who'd performed like this in Tahrir Square, and they said this was the best time in their whole lives, that it was this sort of moment where the political and the sonic came together. Secondly, music that articulates a subcultural politics, often of a subaltern, marginalized population, usually subtracted from conventional political discourse, but suddenly becoming audible under particular revolutionary or at least changing political conditions. The Maraganat or festivals music that sprang up in Egypt around the time of the 2011 revolution was a mixture of shabby or folk styles with hip-hop and electronica, and emerged out of slums such as Al Salam City at the edges of Cairo. Socially, it manifests as the music of cab drivers, music for weddings and other social occasions. And although it occasionally expresses a direct political message, such as in Sadat and Allah 50 cents, the people want £5 of phone credit. The political meaning is more located at the level of making audible a subaltern population within a particular geography, such as metropolitan Cairo, and the elaboration of particular loops of collective enjoyment and identification through spirals of love and violence rendered sonically as dancehall beats. The third possibility would be the experimental music scene that has sprung up around spaces such as 100 Copies in downtown Cairo, and new music from a cosmopolitan crew of performers, including Egyptian-Canadian Sam Shalabi, Cairo-born Maurice Luca, the Palestinian singer Tamer Abu Ghazaleh, and others too. Again, here there is a kind of subcultural community, and the focus is not so much on explicit political messages, but here, rather than populist effective mobilization, the focus is the generation of a sound that articulates a new, hitherto unheard possibility, a sound that is perhaps prophetic in the sense that Jacques Attali uses the word. I don't think these three modes are necessarily separate, and certainly there are musicians in Cairo who participate in all three modes. I feel that the first mode, the activist mode, is fairly well understood, and there is no question that it will play a part, albeit a supporting one, in any future political movements and events. The politics of subcultural sounds are also quite well known today. For example, in a recent article, Buzz and Rumble, Global Pop and the Utopian Impulse, American scholar Jana Brown argues, via Paul Gilroy and Akili Mbembe, and in the context of recent African music such as Angolan Kuduro and Congolese Kanono, that subcultural sound should be understood as part of a utopian impulse. Here's a quote. We can conceive of a utopian impulse as a collective response situated in specific historical conjunctures of oppression and resilience. It suggests a kind of ineffable connection, a collective space free of possessive individualism, a condition of release from the liberal claim to autonomous private ownership as defining the human. The weave of cooperating bodies and voices points to a place where blackness is not defined by its exchange value, where black people call to and with each other with waves not simply shaped by their history as property. It is not transcendent, but intimately embedded in a shared history and the refusal to be contained by it. End of quote. Yet in many ways, Brown's notion of utopia remains at the level of discourse and of a sociology of sound, rather than engaging with politics of subcultural sound itself. Similarly, in terms of the third experimental mode, a recent issue of The Wire devoted to strategies for liberating sound and music struggled to articulate a sonic basis for liberating sound, falling back on models of improvisation as a model for a broader freedom. While this work is important, it is still based on the notion that musical liberation amounts to finding the right kind of social relation. I would like here to focus on the most difficult question, that of how particular kinds of politics might emerge from attention to the sound itself. One of the major debates within sound studies has been whether there even is such a thing as sound in itself. The argument has generally been framed as one between those who believe history, context, and the social and political framing of an otherwise inchoate non-object called sound is what matters, versus those who believe the material of sound, the organization of sounds in whatever form, to be the key. A discussion of the politics of vibration means necessarily operating between and sometimes outside of this dilemma. The question that I ask is under what conditions the full mobilization of the liberatory sound, powers of sound is possible. I'd like to return briefly to Freud and to civilization and its discontents. In conclusion, Freud sets out the struggle between eros and thanatos as being the core dilemma for civilization, and for those subcultural entities that are discontented with it too. Yet he begins the book with an analysis of what he calls the oceanic feeling, a sense of mystical oneness with the universe that his friend Romain Rolland tells him he experiences, presumably as a result of his meditation practices conducted with monks from the Ramakrishna mission. Freud is dismissive of this oceanic feeling, which he interprets as being a residual effect of the baby's gestation period in the mother's womb, and having done so, he moves on to what he considers more compelling substitutive satisfactions, such as drugs, warfare, hermit-like withdrawal, art, and communism. Nonetheless, this oceanic feeling clearly represents a third possibility outside of Eros and Thanatos, or perhaps entangled with them, even if Freud disavows it. I argue that this is the possibility of a fully articulated ontology of vibration. You may say, doesn't musicology already describe the sound in itself? I would say no. I am not simply talking about a musical score or even a recording or a performance considered simply as a set of notes. In his recent book Sonic Bodies, Julian Henriquez sets out the full complexity of a dance hall session in Jamaica over the course of 300 plus pages, from the mobilization of particular physical qualities of sound, to the historicity of the space in which the session occurs and the people who create, promote and attend it, with all its social and political specifications, as well as the specificity of the music and the way it works on or with people. Music is grafted onto this energetic vibrational ocean. Its history is the history of specific forms and shapes of grafting. In grafting, there is the movement of eros towards intimacy. There is also the risk of rejection, of violent separation. Music is a praxis of vibratory grafting. Like all practices worthy of the name, it has to be continually reinvented. I end with a quote from Anthony Braxton, the great free jazz composer. He says, "As a young guy, it was always clear to me that my experience would be complex. Not only the fact that there would be no money being made from this, but rather as an African American with universal impulses, I was a ripe target for misunderstanding, going all the way back to the 1960s. So I wasn't surprised in the end by the nature of the struggle. In fact, I'd gotten used to the nature of the struggle. But it seems to me, and it seemed to me then, that at some point, the African American community, the European American community, all of our communities would have to start looking for, how can I say it? That which has not been there." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. So anyone would like to start? I can take the microphone to you. You can start? I can start? Okay. I have a lot of questions. Thank you. Thank you. So I will start as you suggest. One thing that I find very important about what you said is actually trying to use the ideas that you've brought in the context of what's happening in Brazil right now. So it's very interesting because you describe this wish of appropriation and these vibrations that go through society and the impulse to make them your own, and in doing that, you also become the other. So I would roughly describe it as the openness that actually you are open to the other, you're open to listen to the other, and you are even open to become the other. So Brazil has been fighting along its history between these two impulses, to be open to the other and to be close to the other. I would dare to say, and of course people can disagree with me, that we are living in a moment in which the Brazilian society is inclined in the direction of depropriation rather than appropriation. So we are living in a very closed moment in which we don't want to listen to the other. There's a lot of people full of certainties, and they want that certainty to actually be dominant. So it's a moment in which we can say that we are betraying the very foundation of who we are, because we are a society of people who have appropriated in order to become who we are. So the idea of cannibalism is in the very foundation of the Brazilian society, with Oswald de Andrade, in which he says, all that interests me is the other. So I eat the other in order to become who I am. So my fear is that when you cease to be open to these sorts of appropriations, you actually create an artificial situation, especially in Brazil. So I see that this is not a problem only from the country itself, but it's a problem that I see in Europe, for instance, with the crisis of the refugees and the refusal to assimilate the other and to distinguish yourself from the other in order to believe that you are something immutable. So with all that said, my question to you, sorry for the long preamble, is how do you see this battle between these two, openness versus closeness, and how do you see is the antidotes for reconquering openness or fighting for openness once again? So do you see that is it sustainable to live in this closed society for a long time, or does it provoke social tensions and fractures? And if that is true, how can we use culture to fight against this desire that is contaminating our country and, of course, other parts of the world as well, to become stiff, to become solid, to become integral? How do we fight against integralism?
Thanks. That's a great question. And of course, having written most of this book in Canada and maybe the US, coming to Brazil with at least these kind of cliches and stereotypes of a kind of vibrational erotics everywhere, from the music to a taxi driver extolling to me the virtues of Ipanema Beach as the one place where all Brazilians come to. They take all their clothes off and they are together in a state of kind of almost a utopian lack of separation. And we don't even have that vision in Canada. There's not even a myth like that, really. And so I'm charmed by the myth. And I also wanted to say I was part of a seminar in Toronto last summer, and the organizers of the seminar invited some students of Eduardo Viveiros de Castro to come to talk about cannibalism from the Brazilian ethnographic context. And the members of the seminar were mostly kind of leftist artists from Canada, and they were so shocked or appalled that this ethnographers seemed to be suggesting that there was something like cannibalism, that Amazonian tribes under very specific contexts practiced, that they basically shut down the seminar, saying that it was unacceptable for these ethnographers to make a claim like this. So I think there's also a fear of openness on the left as well as on the right as well, and maybe it manifests in different ways. But I would say global neoliberalism is a good way to think about this. The flow of capital is uninhibited. The flow of capital is allowed free movement. The implication of that, in some sense, surely, is the free movement of populations, the free congregation of populations, the free choice of populations as to what identity they choose to assume, where they live, what their sexuality is, what their gender is, all these kinds of issues. And we're in a moment where the possibility of such a global society is appearing on the horizon for the first time. And our terror at the realization of that possibility is also manifesting with a powerful intensity. And I think even, again, with leftist artists, the kind of disdain for appropriation is quite striking. There's been a real reaction in recent years to the kind of aesthetics of appropriation. And this is talked of in terms of issues of privilege. And of course, it's true that often there is a dynamics of privilege at work in situations where there's appropriation. But mostly the argument happens from a neoliberal idea of private property, where human rights are a matter of everyone owning themselves as a kind of object and then getting to spend themselves according to the private property that they have and that they can then acquire. And in the end, this is an untenable position. It's an untenable position because it's not true. The liberal ideology of everyone existing as a set of private properties can never really take place. And cultures of appropriation point us towards that fact. And I would say dance hall scenes continue, even in their most, debased commercial forms, to produce situations in which this kind of mixing and confusion of bodies does take place, where exposure to ecstasis that takes people beyond themselves happens. And in terms of the generation of the music scene, I was just talking with Magabo, the music producer, this afternoon, and he was just describing various kinds of transit that he sees taking place, of people taking music, particular pieces of music from other parts of the world and twisting it and transforming it. That is still very much ongoing. But I do think we're in a moment of reaction. I would say, I was thinking about this, things like Netflix and Spotify to me are very interesting in those terms. That whereas 10 years ago there was a very kind of vibrant culture of peer-to-peer sharing and downloading, that was very promiscuous, that was not at all concerned with whether anyone really had the right of ownership that allowed them to share or not share something, that in the last 5 years, you've really seen most of that shut down, partly by aggressive legal action, but equally, I would say, by the fact that Spotify and Netflix offer a kind of legally sanctioned pseudo-version of that sharing culture, and mostly, at least temporarily, people seem to accept it. And so long as that's accepted, the more radical possibilities for sharing disappear. And I would also say the more marginal voices also disappear, because you end up with a kind of particular kind of political economy of popularity, which is also what one sees with social media, which also has a ideology of property attached to it in a number of ways. And, but I don't know, philosopher Nick Land said that anytime there's a movement outside or away from capital, capital is incredibly tenacious in terms of reappropriating that move to the outside and repackaging it as part of a market economy again. And I would say that's the state of the game right now, is the sharing economy, the social media as a kind of gambit of the enframing of human possibility. What makes it the state of the art right now is that it mostly seems compelling. We are compelled by it, both in the sense of being charmed by it, but also having no choice. Still, I think some kind of research continues, and I didn't actually speak a whole lot about avant-gardes in my talk, but I still feel like there is such a thing as research. There is research on human possibility, and that is the work of the avant-gardes, and in some sense I see that still continuing today. It's just that research has to produce powerful new possibilities. And I see that happening in dance music still. I don't see it so much in free improvisation scenes. But, you know, like I started interviewing a group of free improv musicians in Beirut. And I was really struck by one of them talking about how difficult it is to organize a free improv music tour of the Middle East right now. And he went through every country from Pakistan to Morocco and talked about what it meant to organize a show in a city in one of those countries. And I was just very moved by someone thinking about that as a possibility and trying to enact that possibility. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. That was like a very good reflection, very useful for the context where we are. I especially like your idea about Netflix and Spotify, because when we were in the file sharing culture, that had a huge impact over music in Brazil, for instance. So you had music scenes like Funk Carioca, which used the MP3s that were downloaded as a source material for creating new music. Same thing goes for Tecnobrega and other appropriation styles here in Brazil. And actually, I fear now that with Spotify, it makes actually you lazy. It's the same with Netflix, because it creates what someone was saying recently in an article that I read, a sort of a global monoculture, in which there is one global official culture that will become the reference for everyone. And of course, you cannot even download the content technically, either from Netflix or Spotify. So it ceases to be raw material for you to remix or reappropriate and create something on top of it. And you turn back into the position of a consumer rather than a producer. So the big promise of the internet was that you would become a producer and a consumer, and you would participate in this dialogue of a perpetual call and response in which you would be provoked by pop music, and then you would have the opportunity to take it and change and turn it into something else. So I really agree with you that a lot of these cultures are dying. And one of the reasons is that you're losing this perspective of having access to the raw materials. So culture no longer is something that you can take and do whatever you want, and it's becoming more and more something that you pay for, and it's delivered to you, but then that's it. So I wonder if you get worried about this sometime, you know?
Yeah, or conversely, I'm curious about what the conditions under which something other than that happens. And it's very striking. I mean, I used the example of Egypt after the 2011 revolution. And it's very striking that there's a proliferation of new musics precisely in that moment of rupture. And most of those musics still continue today, even though obviously there's been a kind of crackdown and Sisi is in control, the military are in control again. Those musics somehow also still continue. It hasn't simply ended. I wrote an article about Egypt in the months before Sisi came to power, and it took me so long to write it that by the time I finished writing it, the Muslim Brotherhood had been, a whole group of people had been executed, and the crackdown had began. And the editors I had at The Wire basically wanted me to totally rewrite the article to make it a doom-laden piece about the tragedy of utopia destroyed or something. And then when I talked to the people who are still living in Cairo, nobody felt that way about it. They still felt very positive about the future and very much inspired by that moment of revolution. So, yeah, I would say in a moment of rupture, interesting things happen. You may be in the middle of a moment of rupture right now here in Rio. So I'm curious whether interesting things happen here. But I spend most of my time, most of my free time talking with a 70-year-old transsexual drone composer who lives in Berlin in a tiny little shack, her name is Catherine Christa Hennigs. She's been pursuing a kind of vision of drone music, which is definitely a form of vibrational ontology, for like 40 years now. And she sits in this shack with a pile of, mathematics textbooks. She's a professional mathematician, her musical equipment. Very, very slowly, year after year, her thought develops and deepens, and strange, rich, new things happen within it. And I really think there's something about this notion of a research culture, and I don't necessarily mean an academic research culture. Fred Moten, in his book The Undercommons, talks about what he calls study. And he says, study isn't what happens in a university classroom. Mostly it does not happen, in fact. He says study is when you're on the bus or on the subway going to the class and you're talking to someone in the class or someone who you go to school with or whatever. That's study, when you're talking about ideas, or maybe you're sitting in a bar and drinking and talking about something. I mean, this could be study now, but it will also be study after we break and have a drink and we're thinking. And for him, he wanted to reclaim a notion of study as a part of everyday life. That study is the generation of possibility within the context of everyday life by what he calls the undercommons, the people, to use an unpopular phrase. And I think without a culture of study, it's actually hard to do much more than generate novelty. And novelty is kind of cool and it could be interesting, but there's a kind of sustained work of collective power and beauty that only happens through the existence of study over a duration of time. And I don't know, maybe social media enables certain kinds of study that were impossible before, but I think the fragmentation of our concentration is also a real challenge in terms of study. That there's something about collective intensity that requires duration, it requires time. And there are so many reasons why we don't have time. We need to go to work, we need to find a job, we don't have any money, etc., etc. And that's where crisis, I think, is not particularly enabling. Crisis actually destroys the possibility of study, which generates new forms of social and aesthetic practice. And somehow we need to collectively regain the possibility of study, I think.
Comentários? Ok.
Let's get to the opportunity. You talk about the vibrations, but vibrations are not the message in terms of words and manifest, communist manifest, and so. In Brazil, we have militaries in power, and a phase of music with very nice musicians making a kind of music that I considered music of message, like your example in Egypt right now, okay? For me, your explanation does not solve a problem that is discussed the musician itself without the piece of politicization, right? I think that there is more vibration in music than politicians, in my opinion, in the history of humanity. I will give you 4 examples. For example, in opera, Rigoletto, Verdi was obliged to not mention the name of the main personal in the opera that he wrote. Without doing that, he could not show us the masterpiece of opera, Rigoletto. I could not have the opportunity to appropriate Rigoletto in Teatro Municipal. Chico Buarque, right now, is a censor of a music of himself that was used in the military dictatorship in Brazil, because it is being used now against the government that is right now in power. You understand the problem of appropriation? The same musician that was using music to make it possible to appropriate, right now is using that to disappropriate in Belo Horizonte. That's a paradox, in my opinion.
Obrigado. Alguém mais quer aproveitar para fazer um comentário? Someone? Hã? Quem? Ah, you want to come. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure what you're saying. I mean, appropriation and counter-appropriation, that's the scary thing about it, is that things can move around, right? But as for your point about vibration not being just being about music, yeah, absolutely. My thought, I guess, is just what one needs to describe vibration is a much more expanded version of what music is. And I'm actually interested in thinking about it mathematically, to be honest. I think there's a way of thinking about music as a mathematical, almost a geometric shape or form, a topos. This is what my mentor Henix does. She argues music is a topos. And yeah, I think the particular form of music really matters. And subcultural scenes exist because they care about the particular shape or form that sound takes, and they share that between them, and they share a knowledge of how to do that, how to make that. And that seems really important to me. But it's not just that they share a knowledge of how to do something, it's that they share a knowledge of how to do something that shakes their reality to the foundation and therefore has a kind of ontological power. And that to me is the interesting thing, and it's true in punk scenes as much as it is in opera, that groups of people share the knowledge of a practice that takes them to this place. And that's what excites me.
Vamos lá. Gente, vamos, se vocês puderem me ajudar, porque o microfone ele vem aqui, pode fazer. Aqui a gente pega uns 3 ou 4 comentários agora, por favor. Vamos lá.
Obrigado. Excuse me. So, what I think what my colleague was saying here is that basically during the military dictatorship back in the 20th century, there was an author called Chico Buarque de Holanda who wrote songs against the dictatorship.
Yeah,
However, now we have the Workers' Party at the moment who's being criticized using the same songs that this artist, Chico Buarque de Holanda, wrote. So my question would be, do you think it's correct of him to reappropriate his songs so they cannot be used as a voice to criticize our current government? Because if I may say so myself, my father actually sings one of his famous songs criticizing the current government. And furthermore, I wanted to ask you, when you meant vibrations, I kind of remembered Octavio Paz. He's a Mexican diplomat and a poet as well. And your definition of vibration reminds me of what he explains, and I can only say it in Portuguese because I don't know the English equivalent of it, mas é poesia. So I'd say poetry. So it's basically that rhythm that is born within us. It isn't external time, but it's an inward time. So it's our personal rhythm that expresses itself and manifests itself into the art form, which could be music, could be, well, poetry, it could be painting, and so on and so forth. So would that be a good comparison, or does your definition of vibration encompass something else?
Yeah, I would say that's one level of it. The French Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre wrote, his last book was called Rhythm Analysis, and it's a beautiful, quite short book where he goes through all the levels at which rhythm operates in society, from personal or individual rhythms to collective social rhythms to cosmic rhythms to natural rhythms. And he's able to or attempts to describe the whole of the universe as the intermeshing of a set of rhythms. So yeah, I would say that's one level. In terms of Chico Buarque, I know these 70s songs, and I never quite understood Chico Buarque's situation in the 70s in Brazil, that he remained here, but he wrote these songs and they were released, but the military also somehow allowed them to be released even though they had a kind of crypto-political message. So I never quite understood what Chico Buarque's place in the history of Brazilian radicalism or not actually was. Like,
Well, I mean, as far as I know, he kind of exiled himself to Italy.
oh, he did? Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't.
and I think, if I'm not mistaken, and some Brazilians may correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where he wrote most of his songs criticizing the government.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, we also had another great composer, Tom Jobim, who wrote a famous song, Meu Sabiá, where he actually uses a masculine noun and makes it feminine, and using women as usual as an allegory to kind of mask his criticism of the dictatorship. In fact, he was so successful with that song that he actually earned the prize for the best written song in Rio de Janeiro. So yeah, I mean, for me it's a bit of a paradox, because Chico wrote a piece of song, a piece of music that reverberates within different cultural groups and within generations. And now all of a sudden he's saying, like, no, these songs I do not want you to use them to reinterpret the current situation just because my political views are different to yours. And if I may add, I was reading an article as well on like cultural behaviors and cultural differences. One thing I'd like to make very people aware of, well, I don't know, maybe you are aware of, but most Anglo-Saxon cultures, they don't tend to be aggressive, like emotionally. Whereas more people like Brazilians or Colombians or Venezuelans or Spanish people, they tend to be emotionally expressive. So for Brazilians, I think, although this is just a matter of a song, the fact is it has a political meaning. And since we're emotional people, our politics usually calls forth our personal values as people. So people get a bit overprotective or oversensitive over political issues. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Let me get a few more comments so that we can hear from more people, and since we don't have too much time, so.
Thank you. My question is about the very concept of appropriation, the word, and how we use it. I'm a researcher on appropriation in literature, and I was reading this week a text that talks about how Nietzsche considered knowledge an invention. So humans are not naturally inclined to knowledge. We fabricate it, we invent it, we create knowledge. And I ask myself, if when we use the term appropriation, we go on the direct to deny that things have an origin, or when we use appropriation, we are simultaneously talking that something is a property of someone, and this someone invented it and created it. So this is something I ask myself, and I wanted to know your opinion. If this term goes in which way, to deny the origin, or to say, no, this is from someone, and we are reusing it?
Yeah, well, that's why I was quoting Heidegger, I guess, is the way Heidegger is thinking about it is entertaining all of the possibilities that you're pointing to there. I mean, he's saying that there is a politics of origin. But that moment of origin is a creative moment in some sense, and maybe there's a Nietzscheanism in Heidegger's thought there. I don't know, I would talk about Foucault maybe, and Foucault's version of Nietzsche and genealogy. You know, for Foucault, every moment of origin of a fact being established is actually a particular configuration of powers and forces in a society, and the establishment of what a particular configuration of forces think as a truth constitutes an act of appropriation. Does that mean that there is no such thing as original thought? I don't know. I read Badiou and I love Badiou, and I happen to believe in something like a struggle for truth. And I personally don't see that contradicts the notion that most of what is presented to us as truth is ideological and is the result of a set of appropriations, and that overturning appropriations is also an appropriative act, really. But there is, and this is why Heidegger talks about Ereigness. Ereigness for him means almost like a core of truth at the very center of the mystery of appropriation. It's almost like there is something there that is not just simply an argument saying, he did this, he said this, therefore it exists. He's saying that the very giving of being that allows anything to be established is in itself a kind of, you are appropriated to the truth. You are appropriated by the truth, into the truth. And that's his kind of model of being after, whatever, 1935.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about something you brought up at the very beginning of the presentation, when you talked about transit and translation and what makes for a meaningful translation. And I just wanted to know if you could address that a little further and maybe how that might relate to appropriation.
Yeah, I mean, well, the kind of question that interests me, like with that South African track I played, and I don't even really know the Adele track that the guy is sampling there. And, you know, he's in Durban, a city on the east coast of South Africa. I don't know what his relationship to Chicago house and the history of house music is. But it's interesting to me, the series of transits that are made there that could go disastrously wrong. It could produce something very dull or boring or useless. Yet, something about the way in which these things are appropriated actually works. And I'm trying to understand that right now. Like what? Because it's easy to say, like there's this famous, what's it called now? Ter Thymlet's record. Ter Thymlet's, he DJs on house music under the name DJ Sprinkles. And he was kind of like a queer house DJ in New York and Chicago maybe in the 80s and 90s. And he made this very beautiful record in the late 2000s where he plays some house beats and then he just rants over them about how house music has been stolen from its origins and how he hates it when house singers talk about universal love, because really house music was specific to particular gay and queer contexts, particular parties in Chicago, particular ethnic groups. It was a black, Puerto Latino scene, and it wasn't universal. It was specific to a very local scene. And that's one version of subcultures, is you would say the authentic, the real, the meaningful music happens from a very specific local context. But what's striking about subcultures is that stuff gets passed around and it doesn't stay in one place. And often the things that develop from the original place are just as powerful or interesting as the so-called original or authentic stuff. And my thought is that okay, let's talk about it in terms of Badiou. There's a fidelity to the musical core of house music that's there in that house music track that I just played to you too. Somehow, even in Durban and South Africa, the core of what makes house music is mastered by these 18-year-old kids with a shitty old IBM computer and Fruity Loops or whatever it is, in such a way that the formal power of what is house, they're able to bring forth again. And again, I'm trying to go beyond a kind of sociological reading of subcultures that just speaks about it in terms of, I don't know, networks or whatever, to trying to think about formally how cultural artifacts can be passed around. And then to think about what makes that powerful or boring, I guess.
So that we can head to the wrap-up, I just would like to check how many people still have questions. No, it's okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to take 5. I'm going to take the 5 questions, but you guys have to promise that you'll do it in a very short way, all right? We agreed? Okay, excellent. So you then use these questions to do the wrap-up, okay?
Sure.
I'm going back to that matter of Netflix, Spotify you were talking about. And, you know, I was reading once about how logics of Netflix and Spotify kind of decrease the value of ownership because people are not, like, downloading stuff or buying stuff. They're just watching it and that's it. It's like the sharing economy modus operandi and all. But as he said, there's no interaction. You cannot get it and modify it. So like the lesser value of ownership could be seen like an evolution of society, but that thing could be a negative thing. So what do you think synthesizes better this model? It just is like an evolution, or not being able to alter it is bad for culture, like in the long term.
Hold that a second, because I'm going to go around like a...
Sure.
Mine is a bit long.
Long?
Yes.
Do your best.
I don't mind.
I want to discuss appropriation failure. There was this event last week where MC Brinquedo, that 14-year-old funk singer, was invited to this very avant-garde hip fashion store. And people that worked there were transsexuals, and everyone was hipster. And this kid came and sang, and everyone was shocked with all the misogyny and everything. And people just posted on Facebook, and people revolted against this kid. And I wanted to discuss what's at play at that, if this kind of masculine attitude can be affirmative some way in his own habitat, like the favela, and also if there's any other event in history where stuff came out differently as this one, as like this appropriation failure came out positively somehow.
I think you can answer this too.
Do you want me?
Otherwise, we will get
Too overwhelmed. I'm not sure what to say about appropriation failure. I mean, I got obsessed with Odd Future for quite a while, and I wrote like very long learned discourses on Odd Future and Tyler the Creator. And part of what I wanted to think through in Odd Future was how close homophobia and the actual flourishing of queerness within hip-hop culture actually were, and how strange it was that the most misogynistic and kind of homophobic statements seemed to coincide with Sid the Kid, an out lesbian DJ, as part of their collective, and then Frank Ocean's coming out as well, and that the, you know, now there is an actual male queer hip-hop culture with people like Leaf. And again, I see the stuff about Freud, Eros and Thanatos. Again, it feels the closer one gets to the core of vibrational power and erotics, the more one seems to enter a zone of kind of insane violence. And the tendency then is to pull back from it. That's what Lacan says about the death drive. He says the death drive is always circling around death cautiously at a distance. And you get a little too close. He says very few people, when they follow their desire, don't start to waver. You start to move to what you desire, and something happens and you freak out. And I think we are globally in a freak out stage. And we're in a freak out stage because we are, in some sense, moving closer to something, to the actual core of our desire. I have no idea how you get through that except through awareness. And I'm interested in Buddhism because I think Buddhism in some sense offers practices of awareness where you don't simply run from what you're afraid of, and you don't simply naively lunge at what you desire. But it's an incredible problem, and the notion that globally every human being has to face this and negotiate it and work through it, it seems an incredible challenge, and yet it seems to be our challenge, the challenge that is unfolding for us.
Okay. His question at the beginning about the moment in Brazil, and we're kind of closed about culture and stuff, makes me think about the movie I just saw called O Abraço da Serpente. I don't know if you heard it. It's a Colombian movie.
Yeah, I actually just saw it in Toronto a month ago, yeah.
That's cool. And so just to summarize quickly, it's about an indigenous culture, and two white guys go to these tribes in Colombia. And the first one that comes meets an indigenous guy that knows everything about the forest. And this indigenous guy doesn't want to share. He thinks that he needs to teach their own people about the forest and the culture. And he's really reluctant about sharing his culture with a white guy. And then a second white guy comes many, many years later. For many spiritual and rational reasons, he decides to share his culture with this guy and gives him the drink. And there's a lot of stuff about like sacred plants that some white people use for fun, and they use it in a very religious and sacred way. So there is this kind of appropriation by white people of the indigenous culture in a way that the indigenous people might not like. But anyway, at the end, he decides to give the guy the plant and stuff. And and maybe he thinks that giving the guy the plant and letting this white guy talk about his culture to the world is the best way to, I don't know, spread the culture. But anyway, my question is, do you think this, and maybe it's a good debate for your question as well, it's the appropriation and reappropriation discussion leads to some sort of conciliation between cultures, like firstly the white and the indigenous were enemies, and then they become friends, or not friends, but they conciliate their relationship after the allowing the appropriation to happen. I was trying to be quick, so it
Yeah, well, I guess that's probably where I would start to talk about gift economies, that the exchange of gifts seems to be is it a version of appropriation? You give a gift and then you get a gift back. But that seems to me a powerful model of sharing, an appropriation versus gift giving and taking. This Japanese philosopher, Kojin Karatani, has a book called The Structure of World History that came out a couple of years ago. And he basically says the entire history of political economy is leading up to a future gift economy, a future global gift economy. And the examples he gives of it are surprising. For example, he says nuclear disarmament is an example of a gift economy. That by giving up nuclear weapons, obviously you take a risk from your point of view as a paranoid Cold War person, but that's what then opens up a new kind of future, or it results in the destruction of everything. But we didn't say anything about gift economies, and I think gift economies are incredibly important in terms of the dynamics of appropriation. And even in Buddhism, I would say the practice of offering a gift is a practice of depropriation. Instead of grasping something, you open up a space in which grasping does not happen. And there's a kind of act of gifting involved in that. In terms of the indigenous stuff, there's a great essay by anthropologist Marilyn Strathern where she basically just says, well, people use indigenous cultures as a model of a free culture, of kind of free sharing of gifts. And if you look at it ethnographically, that is just not true at all. It's very structured, the practice of sharing or not sharing. And in that movie, it's a very ambiguous movie. Like, is he right to share stuff? But the interesting thing about ayahuasca, or I don't think it is ayahuasca. Is it ayahuasca that's being shared? Yeah, Capi. So it is ayahuasca, Yahe. But talk about depropriation. And one of my mentors is Michael Tausig, kind of one of the great anthropologists of Colombian shamanism, and he's just very interested in the kind of anarchy that results when people take ayahuasca together, and that there's a kind of ontological chaos there that he found very interesting, and it's full of violence and eroticism as well, and puking and shitting and people not being able to hold on to anything. It's an incredibly difficult situation, and yet he says when you're exposed to the space of death, that is where the possibility of healing, and for him, healing from the traumas of colonialism actually becomes possible. And I don't know, I mean, naively, I would like to know about Santo Daime and the place of ayahuasca in metropolitan Rio and things like that. And but that's a whole other issue.
We are heading to the last two questions. Just to let you know, all the lectures and the talks that we have here are recorded, so you can actually watch them again. We appropriate the talks from the people who come here, and they're all on our YouTube channel. So if you guys want to watch this one again or watch the previous talks, they're all there. So last two questions.
So my question has a little bit to do, I guess, with the gifts economy you were mentioning, and also with her question about the current Spotify status. Actually, what I was thinking was the following. Appropriation by itself, it goes against the whole notion of ownership when it comes to culture in general, as you were saying. But it is also a fact that we have copyright law as a general thing. And more than that, we have the underlying problem the copyright law tries to address, that is more or less artists have to get paid. So, and this is, of course, a major challenge or even a paradox in relation to the whole production when it comes specifically to subculture, because of, it usually happens in environments where there are no means for, going major. So I would like to know if you have any thoughts on how to solve this apparent paradox of, on one hand, appropriation being a concept that goes against ownership, and on the other hand, the artist is having to get, paid or compensated some way.
Let me get the last question.
Hi. Still on the Spotify and Netflix subject, I was wondering if we take some important things out of the equation, like simplicity, marketing, and just talk about property to justify the success of Spotify and Netflix, because they got the rights, and then the decline of P2P, far share, and so on. Isn't this like a simplistic view, and isn't also a way of appropriation from Spotify and Netflix? They saw something that worked well, they got it, they transform it to attend to a bigger demand, and also the thing about the decline of sampling. And like she said, Spotify and Netflix make people lazier. Isn't sampling also a lazy way to take ownership on something? Before LPs and cassettes, you had to listen to something, understand it, like it, and learn the instrument, learn the media, and do it. And with cassette and LPs, for instance, it became more popular, but also it was a lazier way to do things, lazier and more lazy.
Well, I'm not sure that working harder is an actual justification of something. The fact that it's easier doesn't make it wrong. I think the question, you have to look at the results. And if I listen to that South African track, the way the original has been sampled, the notion that there's this tiny unit of voice which has been turned into a kind of rhythmic unit, is profound. It's not simply laziness. It is an insight into the original, an appropriation of it that transforms it. And but I don't think having to work harder. There's a vision of creative beauty that is not contingent on working harder. In some sense, we want to be able to do more beautiful things easier, but really beautiful things, not just bullshit. With Spotify, I think the question about how do artists get paid is a really important one. And I think it's interesting with Spotify and Netflix that, I mean, all the people I know who work in the film industry or the music industry, they complain that they basically cannot make a living working with Netflix or Spotify. Like it is not a political economic structure that actually supports them. So even though it may be legal, what's different, I mean, the music industry and film industry have always been exploitative, but I guess the form exploitation took was such that a certain number of people adapted to it in order to survive. And that's probably happening now with digital stuff too, that people with their own YouTube channels or whatever. I mean, I have a friend who's a Hollywood lawyer, and what he is doing tends to be a good measure of where the economy is going. And he worked for semiconductors, he worked for the movie industry, he worked for a dating site. Now he works for a Hollywood YouTube channel production company. So capital, it is shifting around. But as for the question of appropriation and artists getting paid, I think we're slowly edging towards a situation in which virtually nobody gets paid except for a very small, 1% of kind of a ruling class. And artists are just one of the people who are not getting paid. People who are getting PhDs are not getting jobs as tenure-track professors anymore. They're getting paid, bare subsistence level wages to teach courses one by one, and tenure jobs are not being replaced, at least in Canada. And jokingly, I would say that something like a global communist revolution is required, and some restructuring of things is required so that people have enough money to live and are able then to take advantage of the powers of appropriation and of sharing culture that are available through digital technologies and others. And ideas of a global minimum wage, for example, or a global living wage, is a very interesting idea. And of course, there are incredible inequalities and imbalances that make the idea just about impossible today. But there are people who are thinking this through. I just don't think using the argument that sharing or downloading music deprives someone of income, therefore we should go back to only consuming music if we pay for the full price of a CD or something. I don't accept that logic, and I don't see that the market accepts that logic either. The market has moved on, and moving back to the old model, I don't think it was such a great model either.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Marcos. It's been really a privilege to listen to you. And we should stop here. Please take a look at our page, look for our further talks, and please help me thank Marcos for being so kind to speak with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.